The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped halfway under my front door like it didn't want to be seen. No return address, no stamp, just thick cream-colored paper and my name typed in sharp black ink. I almost ignored it. Almost went back to my coffee and the view outside my window where the sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the lake. The lake! 2,100 acres of still water, stretching farther than most people could walk in a day. A lake that had been there long before the houses, before the HOA signs, before anyone thought to put rules on something that old. I opened the letter. By the third sentence, my hands were shaking. It informed me, very politely, very confidently, that I was in violation, that my unauthorized control of the lake's water levels was interfering with community aesthetics, that I was required to surrender access to the lake's control structures immediately, and then the line that made my breath catch. Failure to comply will result in legal action, fines, and forfeiture of lake access rights. I laughed, out loud, a sharp, humorless sound, because the one thing they didn't know, the one thing they couldn't have known unless they bothered to check the records that went back over a century, was that I didn't just live by the lake. I owned the water, not the shoreline, not the docks, not the pretty views they marketed in glossy brochures. The water itself. And by the time this was over, that single letter would cost the HOA everything. I inherited the water rights the same way most inconvenient truths are inherited, quietly, unexpectedly, and wrapped in paperwork nobody bothered to read. My grandfather passed away 3 years earlier. He was a stubborn man, the kind who fixed his own roof at 80 and never trusted banks. When his estate was settled, most of it was straightforward. The house, a few investments, a truck that smelled like motor oil and cedar. Then there was the lake, or rather, the rights to it. Buried in a yellow deed from 1912 was a clause transferring full water rights, control mechanisms, and usage authority of the lake basin to his family in perpetuity. At the time, the land around it was farmland. The lake fed irrigation canals, powered a small mill, and served as a water reserve during droughts. Decades later, developers arrived. They bought land, built houses, sold dreams. What they didn't buy, what they never asked about, was the water. The HOA came much later. They put up signs, wrote bylaws, and decided the lake was the centerpiece of their community. They named streets after it, put it on their logo, charged residents extra for lake maintenance. No one ever asked me for permission. At first, I didn't mind. I kept the water level stable, maintained the old control gates, and let people fish and kayak. I figured harmony was easier than conflict. That changed when the complaints started. They wanted the water higher for better reflections, then lower for dock repairs, then higher again for a summer festival. Every request came as a demand. Eventually, the letters started sounding like orders. And now they were threatening to take something that was never theirs. I read the letter again, slower this time. They cited HOA bylaws, community agreements, shared resources. Not a single mention of the deed. I could have responded calmly. I could have sent a copy of the document and ended it there. But something about the arrogance, about the certainty with which they told me to surrender what my family had controlled for over 100 years, made me pause. Instead, I did nothing. For 2 weeks. That's when the fines started. Daily penalties. Escalating amounts. Notices taped to my door. Emails warning of imminent enforcement. Then came the lock. One morning, I walked down to the old control shed, where the iron wheel regulated the lake's outflow, and found a brand new padlock bolted onto the gate. HOA property, according to the sign. I stood there, staring at it, feeling something cold settle in my chest. They had crossed the line. That afternoon, I made a call to a land use attorney recommended by a friend. I sent him scans of the deed, the letters, the fines, and photos of a lock. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, very quietly, "Do they have any idea what they've done?" That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end with an apology, because when an HOA overreaches, they usually expect people to fold. They don't expect history to fight back, and they definitely don't expect the water itself to be on someone else's side. The HOA didn't wait for my response. 3 days after I found the lock on the control shed, A crew showed up in reflective vests and hard hats, hauling equipment like they owned the place. They moved with the confidence of people who had never been told no and had no reason to expect it now. I watched from across the lake as they unloaded concrete forms near the spillway. They were going to modify it. That's when I realized this wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about control. I drove down and parked my truck where they couldn't miss it. The crew leader approached me with a clipboard and a forced smile. "HOA authorized work," he said before I could speak. "You'll want to stand clear." I asked who signed the authorization. He pointed to a laminated badge hanging from his vest. "Lake Authority Committee." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "There is no Lake Authority Committee," I said. "There's a gate, a wheel, and a deed from 1912. That's when he told me to take it up with the HOA board. So I did. That night, I attended their monthly meeting for the first time. The room was packed. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee and self-importance. The lake glowed on a slideshow behind them like a hostage photo. The board president, a man who'd never seen a rule he didn't like, spoke before I was even acknowledged. "We're here to address ongoing interference with community resources." Interference. I stood and placed a copy of the deed on the table. "This," I said, "is not a community resource." They didn't even look at it. Instead, the treasurer slid a packet across the table. Fines, fees, enforcement costs, and a notice of lien intent against my property. That was the moment they made their biggest mistake. Because you can threaten a homeowner, but you don't threaten someone who owns a water supply. The next morning, my attorney called back. He had spent the night digging. Turns out, the lake wasn't just decorative. It was a primary stormwater retention basin for the entire development. The overflow system fed into a downstream river under state-managed environmental permits. Permits tied to my control structure. Permits that listed me as a responsible party. "Did you authorize any modifications?" he asked. "No." "Then they're in violation of state water law," he said, "and possibly federal." That's when we stopped reacting and started planning. We sent a certified letter to the HOA, not a warning, a notice, immediate cease and desist, unauthorized access, illegal modifications, trespass, environmental risk, demand for removal of all locks and equipment within 72 hours. We attached copies of the deed, the permits, and a very polite suggestion that they consult counsel immediately. Their response came fast and reckless. They denied everything, claimed the lake was a shared amenity, asserted historical use, accused me of hoarding water and weaponizing infrastructure. Then they doubled the fines and filed an injunction. They wanted a court order to take over the lake. That's when the gloves came off. During discovery, we uncovered something beautiful. The developer, years earlier, had attempted to acquire the water rights and failed. The deal fell apart when my grandfather refused to sell. Instead of disclosing that failure, they marketed the lake anyway. The HOA inherited the lie. Worse, they had been collecting lake maintenance fees without legal authority. Hundreds of homeowners paying for something the HOA never owned. My attorney leaned back in his chair when we saw the numbers. "This isn't just your case anymore," he said. The court ordered an inspection of the spillway. State officials arrived, then environmental regulators, then engineers. The concrete forms the HOA installed, non-compliant. The altered water level, in violation of runoff permits. The lock control shed, obstruction of a regulated system. The fines they threatened me with, they were now facing fines that made theirs look like parking tickets. At the next HOA meeting, the tone had changed. No slideshow, no confidence, just lawyers. Their president avoided my eyes. I didn't speak. I didn't need to, because for the first time, the lake wasn't just scenery. It was evidence, and it was about to wash away every assumption they built their authority on. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand pillars, no dramatic music, just beige walls, a judge with tired eyes, and two tables facing each other like dueling islands. Still, the air felt heavy, like everyone in the room understood that what was being decided here reached far beyond paperwork. The HOA's legal team arrived first. 3 attorneys, Crisp suits, matching folders. The kind of confidence that comes from believing the law exists to reinforce authority, not question it. My attorney arrived with a single briefcase and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. When the judge called the case, the HOA attorney stood immediately. He spoke about community harmony, about shared amenities, about how one individual had disrupted the balance by refusing to cooperate. I watched the judge's pen stop moving. Then my attorney stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue philosophy. He simply handed the clerk a document older than the courtroom itself. The deed. He walked the judge through it slowly, every clause, every transfer, every reaffirmation across generations. He explained water law, riparian rights, and the legal difference between using water and owning it. Then he dropped the word that changed everything. Unauthorized access, unauthorized modification, unauthorized obstruction of a regulated water control system. The HOA attorney objected. The judge overruled. Next came the permits. State-issued, federally referenced, still active, still listing my family name as a responsible authority. The judge leaned forward. So the Homeowners Association altered a controlled water system without permission? Yes, Your Honor. An installed lock preventing the authorized party from accessing it? Yes, Your Honor. The judge closed the folder. That sound echoed louder than anything said all morning. Court recessed for lunch. When we returned, the HOA posture was different. Their attorney asked for time, then more time, then requested mediation. The judge denied it. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a violation. Then the financials came out. The HOA had been collecting lake maintenance fees for years, money earmarked for dredging, shoreline work, and infrastructure they didn't legally control. Homeowners in the gallery began whispering. Some stood up and left. Others stayed, stunned. My attorney presented the numbers calmly. If the HOA didn't own the lake, then they had no authority to levy those fees, which meant restitution. The HOA president whispered urgently to his lawyer. Too late. The judge ordered an immediate injunction. No further access. No further modifications. Removal of all HOA-installed locks and structures within 48 hours. Full environmental remediation under state supervision. But the most devastating order came last. A forensic audit. I felt the room shift. Because audits don't just find mistakes. They find patterns. Within weeks, the HOA unraveled from the inside. Board members resigned. The treasurer disappeared. Emails leaked. Homeowners demanded explanations. Turns out, the lake wasn't the only thing mishandled. Funds were commingled. Contract awarded without bids. Maintenance fees quietly redirected. The lake had been the thread. Pull it, and everything else came apart. I started getting knocks on my door. Not angry ones. Apologetic ones. People who had paid into something they didn't understand, who had trusted a board that never checked its own authority. I told them the truth. I never wanted control. I just never surrendered it. The final hearing was almost anticlimactic. The HOA entered a settlement. They relinquished all claims to the lake, agreed to dissolve the Lake Authority Committee, returned fees to homeowners, paid fines, covered legal costs, and then, quietly, they disbanded. No announcement, no apology, just a website taken down and signs removed one by one. The lake didn't change. The water stayed calm, but the community around it did. Where there had been certainty, there was humility. Where there had been control, there was caution. On the last day, I walked to the control shed. The lock was gone. The wheel turned easily beneath my hand, just as it always had. I adjusted the water level, not for aesthetics, not for festivals, but for balance, the way it had always been done. Because power doesn't belong to those who claim it loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the quiet things people forget to check. And sometimes, if you're not careful, it belongs to the water. The day the HOA officially dissolved, nothing dramatic happened. No announcements, no emergency meetings, no apology letters, just silence. The signs disappeared first, the ones that said private lake access and HOA property. Someone must have taken them down at night. because they were gone by morning, leaving pale rectangles on sunburned posts like scars that hadn't healed yet. Residents noticed immediately. Without the HOA, nobody knew who was in charge anymore. And that's when the real trouble started. The lake had always been the center of gravity, whether people admitted it or not. Without an authority figure telling them what they could or couldn't do, everyone suddenly felt entitled. New docks appeared overnight. Fire pits crept closer to the shoreline. Boats multiplied. Jet skis, loud, invasive things, cut across quiet water at dawn. People assumed that because the HOA was gone, the lake was free. They were wrong. I didn't stop anyone at first. I watched. I listened. I let the water tell me what it needed. Within weeks, erosion lines appeared where vegetation had been stripped away. The western bank started slumping. Algae blooms crept in where fuel and fertilizer washed into the shallows. The same people who once demanded higher water level for reflections now complained about murky water. They came to me not as an authority, but as a problem solver. What are you going to do about it? They asked. That question hit harder than any legal threat ever had. Because technically, I could do nothing. I owned the water. I controlled the flow. I had no obligation to manage people. But ownership isn't just power. It's responsibility, whether you ask for it or not. The first town meeting after the HOA's collapse was chaos. No board, no rules. Just residents talking over each other in a school gym, voices echoing off the walls like a bad idea gaining momentum. Someone suggested forming a new HOA. That idea died fast. Someone else suggested turning the lake over to the county. I stood up then. The room went quiet, not because I demanded it, but because they'd finally realized something important. I was still there. I don't want to control your homes, I said, and I don't want to police your weekends. But the lake isn't a free-for-all. It never has been. I laid out the facts. Environmental regulations, water quality standards, liability. If someone polluted the lake, it was on me. If erosion damaged downstream property, it was on me. If the spillway failed, it was on me. They hadn't inherited freedom. They'd inherited consequences. We formed something new, not an HOA, not a committee with power, but a stewardship council. Voluntary, transparent, advisory only. No fines, no enforcement, no authority over the water. Just education and coordination. People signed up reluctantly at first, then eagerly, because once control disappears, cooperation becomes the only option left. Not everyone was happy. A handful of former board members tried to rally opposition. They whispered about lawsuits, about public access claims, about eminent domain. None of it went anywhere. The records were clear, the permits intact, the law settled. What surprised me most wasn't the resistance, it was the apologies. People I'd never spoken to before knocked on my door with baked goods and awkward smiles. They told me they hadn't known, that they trusted the HOA, that they were sorry. I accepted every apology, not because I needed them, but because communities fracture when people are too proud to admit they were wrong. The lake slowly recovered. We planted native grasses along the eroded banks, restricted fuel-powered watercraft near sensitive zones, coordinated cleanup days. I adjusted the water levels carefully, small changes, long-term thinking. For the first time, people noticed. Not the drama, the balance. One evening, I stood on the dock as the sun set low and gold across the surface. The water reflected the sky perfectly, not because anyone demanded it, but because it was healthy enough to do so. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. The HOA hadn't failed because it didn't have enough power. It failed because it had too much and no understanding of what it was meant to protect. Authority without knowledge is just noise, and ownership without stewardship is just a delay before collapse. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because history mattered, and because water remembers who respects it. The lake had outlasted farms, developers, boards, and bylaws. It would outlast me too. The only question was whether the people living beside it would learn that some things aren't owned by force, but by care. The lake stopped being the headline. That's how I knew we were doing something right. No more emergency meetings. No more rumors flying faster than the wind across open water. The Stewardship Council met once a month, sometimes less, and mostly talk about mundane things: water clarity reports, shoreline vegetation, seasonal adjustments. Normal things. But normal doesn't mean easy. Owning the water meant I never really clocked out. Every heavy storm woke me up. Every dry spell made me calculate inflow and evaporation. When algae appeared upstream, I spent weekend coordinating testing instead of resting. People assumed I was fine with it. They didn't see the quiet trade-offs. I stopped taking long trips. I hesitated before selling the house. I kept insurance policies most people never think about. There were nights I stood by the spillway alone, listening to water move through old stone and steel, wondering whether my grandfather ever felt the same weight. I finally understood why he never sold. Not because he was stubborn, because he knew once control left the hands of someone who cared, it would never come back. Some residents still resented me. Not openly, but in that passive way that shows up in sideways comments and long pauses. Must be nice to own the lake. You get the best view, after all. I guess we just have to trust you. They weren't wrong. Trust is uncomfortable when it's uneven. I made it a point to be visible, to explain decisions, to invite questions, even hostile ones. Transparency wasn't required by law, but it was necessary for peace. One summer, a drought hit harder than anyone expected. Water levels dropped. Docks sat higher than usual. The shoreline pulled back, exposing rocks no one remembered. Complaints returned. Not demands, but worry. That difference mattered. I reduced outflow to preserve depth. Limited irrigation draws. Coordinated with downstream users. Balanced human convenience against ecological survival. Someone suggested lowering standards just this once. I refused. The lake survived the drought. Not comfortably, but intact. That winter, a former HOA board member approached me at a coffee shop. He looked older, tired. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said. We all did. I believed him. Intent doesn't erase damage, but it explains it. He asked if I ever regretted fighting back. I thought about the sleepless nights, the legal bills, the tension that followed me through grocery store aisles and community events. Then I thought about the lake as it was now, clear, stable, quiet. No, I said, but I regret that it came to a fight at all. Spring returned slowly. Birds nested where jet skis once roared. Reeds grew thicker along the banks. Kids learned to fish again, not because someone marketed it, but because it was there. One afternoon, I found an old photo in my grandfather's things. Black and white. The lake nearly empty of development. A man standing by the control wheel, hand resting on iron, eyes squinting into the sun. On the back, in fading ink, he'd written, "Hold the line. The water does the rest." That line stayed with me, because control isn't about dominance. It's about restraint. I realized something else too, something harder to admit. If the HOA had approached me differently, if they'd asked instead of demanded, none of this would have happened. They didn't lose because they were wrong about the lake's importance. They lost because they believed importance gave them ownership. That belief shows up everywhere. In neighborhoods, in governments, in families. People confuse proximity with authority. The lake taught me otherwise. As years passed, property values stabilized, not because of control, but because of consistency. New buyers were told the truth up front. No illusions, no marketing language. This lake is privately controlled, they were told, and carefully managed. Some walked away. That was fine. The ones who stayed understood something rare. Not everything beautiful is for sale, and not everything owned is meant to be used without thought. I still walk the shoreline most evenings, not to check on people, but to check on the water. It tells me when something's wrong. It tells me when to wait. And sometimes, when the light hits just right and the surface goes glass smooth, it reminds me why some inheritances are burdens disguised as gifts. The lake doesn't care how the story ends. That was the first thing I understood once everything finally went quiet. No more meetings. No more lawyers. No more neighbors stopping me mid-walk to ask what was going to happen next. Life settled into a rhythm so ordinary it almost felt unreal after all the noise. The lake stayed. It stayed when the HOA signs came down. It stayed when the lawsuits were filed. It stayed when people argued, apologized, rebuilt, and moved on. Water has a way of humbling you like that. Years passed, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, steady changes. Trees grew taller. Shoreline softened. Kids who once watched the courtroom drama from the back rows learned to swim in the shallows their parents had fought over. Sometimes I'd hear someone tell the story wrong. They'd say I took down the HOA, that I won the lake, that I proved a point. I never corrected them, because none of that was true. The HOA collapsed under its own assumptions. The lake was never something to win. And the point proved itself long before I ever opened that letter. What really happened was quieter. Someone checked the records. Someone respected history. Someone refused to hand over responsibility to people who didn't understand it. That's not a victory story. It's a stewardship story. One evening, a storm rolled in faster than expected. Dark clouds folded over the water, and wind rippled the surface into long, nervous lines. I stood by the control shed as rain began to fall, heavy and cold, rattling the roof. I adjusted the wheel just a fraction, enough to handle the surge without stressing the system. The lake responded. It always does. That's the thing people miss when they talk about ownership. True control isn't loud. It isn't visible. And it isn't enforced with signs or fines. It's exercised in moments no one else sees. My grandfather understood that. He never talked about the lake like it was a prize. He talked about it like it was a responsibility that happened to be beautiful. I finally understood why he kept the deed folded in a fireproof box instead of framing it on the wall. Power doesn't need decoration. Sometimes, I imagine what would have happened if I'd ignored that first letter. If I'd handed over the keys. If I'd trusted the HOA to do the right thing. The lake would still be here, but it wouldn't be the same. It would be engineered instead of balanced, optimized instead of alive, managed for appearances instead of endurance. The difference matters, even if most people never notice it. That's the lesson I carry now. Not every overreach announces itself as tyranny. Sometimes it wears polite language and official letterhead. Sometimes it calls itself community. And sometimes the only thing standing in its way is an old piece of paper and someone willing to say, no. I don't know who will inherit the water rights after me. Maybe a relative. Maybe someone I haven't met yet. Maybe no one at all. But I know this. Whoever it is will inherit more than a lake. They'll inherit trust, not from a board or a document, but from an ecosystem that responds to care and punishes neglect without malice. The lake doesn't remember the HOA. It doesn't remember the meetings or the fines or the arguments, but it remembers balance. It remembers restraint, and it rewards those who learn the difference between owning something and understanding it. On calm mornings, when the mist lifts and the surface reflects the sky so perfectly it feels like you could fall upward into it, I think about how close we came to losing something irreplaceable, not to malice, but to certainty. Certainty is dangerous. It convinces people they don't need to ask, that they don't need to look back, that what exists must belong to whoever shows up last with the most rules. The lake taught us otherwise. It taught us that history matters, that authority has limits, and that some things endure precisely because they refuse to bend to convenience. I inherited water rights, but what I really inherited was a reminder. The most powerful forces don't need permission to exist. They only ask that we don't forget who they belong to, and sometimes they belong to themselves.